Hi, everyone. I'm Vince Molinaro, and welcome to this episode of the Lead the Future podcast. I'm really excited to have Rita McGrath as our guest today. She is a best-selling author, a sought-after strategy and innovation speaker, and a longtime professor at Columbia Business School. As I said, she is one of the top experts worldwide on strategy and innovation and is consistently ranked among the top 10 management thinkers in the world, including the #1 award for strategy by Thinkers 50. And her work has had a significant impact on many Fortune 500 companies. And so she balances her scholarly work as a professor and through her research, but also with real world application on large companies and how they operate to be successful. Her newest book on strategic inflection points is entitled Seeing Around Corners: How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen. This book came out in 2019 and is what we will be focusing our conversation with Rita today. But she's also the author of 4 other books, including the bestseller, The End of Competitive Advantage, that was published by the Harvard Business Review in 2013. So I'm really thrilled to have Rita with us today to really talk about how can leaders do a better job of navigating critical inflection points. So welcome, Rita. We really do appreciate the time you've carved out of your busy schedule for us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So in reading your book, there is a line that jumped out at me. And I do want to begin there because it was sort of just a great line. And you say that, you see yourself as someone who isn't so much a leadership expert, but a strategy scholar. And that you've also found a high degree of frustration with the proliferation of leadership models. And as someone who spends, his life working with companies to help them be better leaders, this, of course, I had to ask you, what were you thinking about that, and what's been your experience around that?
Well, I think, strategy and leadership, of course, are intimately connected. I don't think you can execute strategy well without great leadership. But what I find frustrating is we kind of have many, many, many variations on similar themes. And you would think by now we'd have settled on a few core elements that great leaders share. and everybody, I think maybe it's the competition to own particular buzzwords, but
Right.
people are constantly coming up with like the ultimate framework for leadership. And yet, at their core, there must be something common about them.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that what that also does is it probably confuses the intended audience, which is leaders and organizations, right? And sometimes it can be more complicated. So I wanted to understand that. And I completely agree with you, right? That intersection of strategy and leadership is so critical, which leads to, your work on strategic inflection points. So as someone who is a strategy and innovation expert, how did you sort of lead yourself to this work on inflection points, and how do you think about and define them?
So the original work on strategic inflection points that was popular was by Andy Grove back in the 90s. He wrote this fabulous book called Only the Paranoid Survive. And I was intrigued by that idea, and also intrigued by the fact that since then, nobody really picked up on that topic. So that was a starting point. And it crystallized to me with the recognition that strategic inflection points feel when they happen, as though they happened out of the blue overnight. Nothing like this was anticipated. And yet when you really look at them, it's a lot more like the Hemingway phrase, right? How did you go bankrupt? Well, 2 ways. Gradually and then suddenly. And so too with strategic inflection points. So I define a strategic inflection point as some characteristic, typically in your external environment, that creates a 10x shift in what's possible. So it could be 10x faster, 10x cheaper, 10x better in some way. And that forces you to have to change how you do things because your systems are all tuned to the old limits. And this new possibility has created a completely new, you can think of it almost like an envelope of constraints that's been lifted now. And you can do things in surprising new ways.
Yeah, and it's all, and like you, influenced by Grove's work, and I love his quote, right? It's that opportunity to either rise to new heights or it signals the beginning of the end. And in your book, you talk about companies that have done both, those that have been able to spot things early, respond appropriately. And we know of stories of companies where they've not been able to figure that out. So the first step, obviously, is actually even noticing something is happening. And what's your sense, because you talk about that sometimes our blind spots can get in the way. So as leaders, what do we need to pay attention to make sure we're not missing things or dismissing or marginalizing certain things at the edges that might be happening and critical to our businesses?
I think the most important thing to have as a routine is the ability to get information from what I call the edges of the organization, because the real competitive threat that's existential is not going to come in a wrapped package at the conference center, in that corporate headquarters. It's, the guy on the loading dock that says, well, that's weird. I never saw that brand in here before. Or the person who's off the phone with the customer saying, well, why did they say that Acme Company's product was okay, even though it's much worse than ours? So it's these weak signals that you need to be paying attention to. And I think one of the problems leaders have as they get more senior is they get wrapped in bubble wrap. People get afraid to tell you things. So you need to really create an environment of ruthless candor, where people are not only invited to, but expected to present facts that might be uncomfortable. And you have to get really good at creating environments where that happens on a regular basis. Grove talked about finding helpful Cassandras. And the reality is there's always someone that sees it. Always, in any situation I've studied where there was some catastrophic thing that happened to a company, there are always people. Typically, though, they're not in your strategy group. They're not in the senior leadership team. They're not in positions of power. They're where they're not much being listened to. So your scientists, for example, scientists are really good at saying, well, given the trajectory of how this thing is unfolding, here's where it's likely to be in 5 years. And that could completely upend our business. Or your sales force, or people that are doing customer service. And oftentimes they see it. They're very clear about it. And in fact, they probably talked about it for years. And they at headquarters don't know a thing, right? So how do you get that insight? Because that's where the insights really emerge.
Yeah. So I'm curious, as your book came out in 2019, and a lot has happened since that time, globally and obviously in the world of business and the pandemic. Have those events, how have they shaped your thinking about your work around strategy innovation, but more particularly around how companies need to manage strategic inflection points? Because certainly with our, we work with companies that themselves say they're at an inflection point. And what we're finding now is it's not just one thing they're dealing with, right? It's multiple things coming together at the same time. And I don't know if that's consistent with your work, but I'm curious, how has your thinking evolved over the last 2 to 3 years?
Well, it's actually been a real boon, for once I got the timing of a book right, which is hard to do. I think what's interesting to me is there have been a series of phases. So the first phase was just shock and reaction, and I actually think most organizations surprised themselves by how well they did. It wasn't pleasant, it wasn't fun, but we banded together. We realized this was mission critical and urgent. It wiped all the politics and all the nonsense off the agenda. We really got the job done, right? Then we had this period of kind of, okay, well, how long is this going to last? And there was a variation in how companies responded. So some were just like, oh, we're just going to wait this out, and then things will go back to normal. Some were in existential threat mode. So if you're in the performing arts business or sports or airlines or hotels or anything that depends on people getting together in large numbers, you kind of went into lockdown survival mode, right? And then there were those that said, hang on, this is a fantastic opportunity to get rid of stuff, to accelerate stuff, to really move on strategic things that hadn't been part of the top of the agenda before. So there was really a variation in how people moved. And now I think we're at this fascinating moment where we've been learning for 2 years how things are, right? Yeah. And in fact, I recently wrote an article about this. And now we're kind of having to pick up pieces of what used to be, right? So travel and gatherings and meeting planning. But we've also got this overlay of now we've seen all these new possibilities. So we've accelerated our digital footprints. We've learned how to work remotely. We've learned how to collaborate from a distance. And we're not giving all those things up because we've learned how to do them. And so we're at this fascinating moment now where we're having to combine what was the old way of doing things with these new things that we've learned. And it's been a very uneasy transition for an awful lot of both people and organizations.
Yeah. It's funny as you're speaking, I'm thinking of one of the things I've certainly noticed is a lot of the very subtle, small innovations that have happened in response to the challenges that companies face, that, in many ways, it was like they never would have thought about it until they were forced in it. And a lot of times these are not necessarily dramatic shifts, but subtle things that then just improve customer service, streamline the way a company operates. And it's just been fascinating to see these just day to day as a consumer, going to a grocery store, going to a plumbing store, and seeing these little innovations that, again, only would have happened because of us being put into it. And what you speak about, in terms of what you just said, but also what you write about, is there is this ability that we need to build that capability to learn fast. And what have you learned are what kind of are the barriers that prevent us from learning fast, and what are 2 or 3 things that anybody in a leadership role can pay attention to accelerate their ability to learn in these moments? Because that's really what the task is, right? Learning new ways of working and operating and adding value to customers.
Well, I think the biggest barrier to learning is the human hunger to get to a solution. The problem presents itself, you want to solve it and move on. And so I'll do that again. So a problem presents itself, you want to solve that and you want to move on. When instead you'd be better served in many cases by stopping and pausing and thinking and saying, wait a minute, what are the range of possible outcomes that I could be pursuing now? And how would I know which was the right one? So taking more time up front. Secondly, we know that learning benefits enormously from repetition. So the first time you do anything, you're going to be bad at it. The first time you try to do ride a bicycle or write a paper or do whatever. And so breaking big uncertain situations down into component projects where we can learn quickly, right? And in rapid small cycles, that's a really good way to foster learning instead of trying to do things in a great big giant leap.
So you then kind of, to me, that's sort of a transition, that ability to learn fast. But what you also talk about, and as I read through your ideas, means spotting and responding is one thing, but you also write about the need for leaders to sort of galvanize that entire organization to do exactly that, right? Embrace new ways of thinking and behaving. And that galvanizing is such a strong word, and because it so captures what the work is. So what have you learned, and what are some examples of leaders or organizations that have done a great job of galvanizing the entire organization when they're starting to see these signals at an inflection point?
Well, in the book, I talk about Klockner, that saw the advent of digital platforms as a real existential threat to their business. So Klockner's a metals distributor in Germany, based in Germany, and they were very manual. I mean, they were still accepting orders by fax. They had excess inventory everywhere. And their CEO, a guy named Gisbert Ruhl, kind of looked around the corner and he said, wait a minute, if we don't create a platform, if we don't go digital, somebody else is going to do it. And once they've done that, that could be the end of our business. So they made the very determined effort to really embrace digital. And they started at first doing it internally. So they gathered together the senior leaders and had an offsite, and that got nowhere. And so what they then did was they took 2 engineers and put them in Germany's equivalent of Silicon Valley, which is in Berlin. And they said, look, just do something digital that makes us easier for customers to do business with. Like, that's all we want. Just start there. And what they did was they automated the ordering system, which had been done by faxes before this. And eventually, step by step, they got the organization to the point where now they have a digital platform. So sort of think of it as Amazon for metals ordering. But they've also created an industry-wide platform for ordering metal products, which has been attempted for time after time after time since the early 90s, and nothing had succeeded until this one. So what Ruhl did was he used a lot of subtle and overt, but also very subtle inputs to get people galvanized. So one of his inputs was a thing he calls non-hierarchical communication, which for a German company, that's saying a lot, right? And this happened to be Yammer. And what he did was he gave everybody in the company a Yammer account and basically said, look, if there's something going on in your part of the company you think I would benefit by knowing about, send me a note. And it doesn't have to be big and formal, and let's get rid of all that hierarchy. Just tell me, and I'd be interested. And then what was fascinating was he never was punitive, right? So like if somebody said this is all screwed up, he never went to the manager of that unit or the group and like dumped on them, right? He said, well, I'm glad you told me. Let's see what we need to do to get this to be correct. Let's see what we need to do to fix this. And I think it created in the organization this sense that, owning your mistakes was okay, not being punitive about things going wrong. That was a normal part of and let's all be in this together, making progress, moving forward. And I think that's tremendously important, that human element of, let's problem solve together rather than blaming each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can imagine the environment that's created where, in many ways, with that strategy, he was, kind of really reducing and eliminating fear. And that if people then kind of get a sense of, wow, he's actually hearing it and we're taking action on it, that just becomes self-perpetuating and you'll get more and more of it, which is, an exciting example. And at the end, not very complicated, right? It's a pretty simple thing to do, using Yammer to get those insights. And but he believed in it so much. So it's a great story for sure. So what you're really talking about, and as you get kind of to the end of the book, there is sort of that chapter, because, a lot of times the thinking around inflection points tends to, I find we always kind of look at it, obviously, organizationally, but you really talk about how we need to kind of see around corners in our own lives. And there's a real personal element to that in our leadership. And so what do all leaders need to think about? Because in many ways, I don't think there's an organizational inflection point without a personal one as well.
I think
and what's your sense on that? What do we need to pay attention to as leaders, whether I'm a people manager at the front lines or in the C-suite?
I think that's true. I think organizational growth almost always requires personal growth, and that requires reflection, and it requires practice, and it requires the ability to be uncomfortable and to see what the next thing is. I think as humans, we sometimes fall into the trap of trying to stay where we are comfortable. And trying to keep that equilibrium of what's familiar and what we think we can control and what feels comfortable for us, when really an inflection point is often a fantastic opportunity to take what you're doing to the next level. An analogy I love is, if you go back to Apollo 13, when here's this rocket like stranded in the middle of nowhere, and the normal reaction would have been, well, let's just fire up the engines and turn around and come back to Earth. But the dilemma was that there wasn't enough power to do that. So they had to come up with something different. And what they eventually did was they sped toward the moon, slingshotted around the moon, and used the moon's gravity to actually provide the energy to get back to Earth. And I think if you think about an inflection point that way, it can be enormously liberating. How many people do you know who've had a bad experience? So they got fired, they got laid off, they got divorced, something that you perhaps would have preferred to avoid in life. And yet, sort of a few years after that, they look back on it and they go, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I hear this all the time from people that got fired, or the board squeezed them out, or something happened. And they're like, it forced me to rethink. It forced me to take a fresh look at my priorities. It forced me to really focus on what matters to me. And I'm thinking to myself, why is it more of us don't do that without being forced into something that was kind of unpleasant at the time?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Like what in that crisis, or that negative, what appears to be a negative experience, what's that hidden opportunity just waiting for you to unlock? That would be a great sort of frame of mind to have in those moments. But I agree with you. We see that in our work, where we have leaders kind of reflect on the experiences that have most shaped them. And what they find is those low moments were the opportunities. And once they were able to kind of make that shift in their own minds, and all of a sudden they were able to reach to a new height. And if they weren't, they kind of stayed stuck for quite some time. And that's certainly a key lesson for us. So around lessons, and this is the last question. It's one we ask all of our podcast guests, and it's really, we spend a lot of time thinking about helping young people, those who have just entered the workforce, or maybe are a new team lead or supervisor, kind of their first formal people leadership role. I'm curious, from your experience, Rita, what words of wisdom or leadership advice would you give young people today, because they're entering the world of work at a fascinating time of opportunity, but also concern? What would you say?
I would say focus on learning, and focus on building your network. Those are two very important things. And when I say learning, I mean, take the opportunity to try new things. If your organization offers, for example, cross-company community groups, join one, get involved. Try to build your network of people, not just the people that you feel comfortable with, but with people who are different from yourself. And really think about how you're going to build this next tour of duty, because increasingly we're thinking less and less about career ladders and more about career lattices, almost, where the jobs that you're doing may not be steps up some kind of ladder. They may instead be zigzags. And so be thinking about what are the valuable skills this particular tour of duty can give you, and what do you want to be prepared for the next one. I think it's also very useful as you're early in your career to try to get comfortable with, what are your passions? What are the things that really excite you? And what are the things that you're very good at, perhaps, but which don't necessarily give you that sense of richness or fulfillment that you need to have? And the more you can reflect on that early on, the less you're likely to spend time wasted at, going to law school because you didn't know what else to do, and then you discover you hate the idea of being a lawyer, and all that time goes to waste. So I think getting comfortable with what is really fulfilling for you early on is great. And I guess the last thing I would say is don't let other people define what that is. There's plenty of people who are happy to tell you what you should do in life, right? And there's plenty of alternative paths to that.
Yeah, and the opportunity to carve your own path is certainly possible now more than it's ever been. So completely agree with you. Well, Rita, I want to thank you so much for the generosity of your time and your spirit of giving, your wonderful ideas. It's an honor to spend time with you and learn from you. I know we appreciate all the great work that you and your team do and helping companies be the best they can be. So I really do appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Okay.